Thank you all so much for being here, sharing this strange time of today with us. It's really wonderful to be together, in a sense, in community with people who believe in this work and the power of oral history and connectivity and compassion and all of those good things. So I really appreciate everyone making time, choosing to spend your time this way this evening. As folks are joining in, feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us from, maybe what time it is there. And I've always enjoyed, I'll leave it at that because I kind of like seeing how people adapt this intro prompt. Oftentimes we get really poetic things about the weather, and whatever it is that you would like to share in that space, please feel free. So hi everyone, good afternoon, evening. Looks like most of us are in afternoon and evening. Thank you to any who are in like very early morning or the middle of the night joining us. We appreciate your valiant efforts. Welcome to Empowering Youth Through Indigenous Stories, the third event in this year-long oral history workshop series, Oral History in Power. My name is Carlin Liuzia, and I help to coordinate the series along with Amy Starachesky, and I also instruct the accompanying course here in the Oral History Master's Program. As I was saying to Suzanne just in the room before you all came in, I've kind of been a little all over the place thinking about the ways that I want to create an environment for us this evening. And the things I've been thinking about when Amy first invited me to help host these events, I was very nervous about public speaking, which hasn't really changed, but I started out very much in a checklist mindset and with a literal checklist of moving pieces to remember to talk about, and have since kind of been trying to slow down with that and just kind of take space at the beginning to breathe and center and think about how we want to start our time together. One of the sort of checklist items that I've really enjoyed reflecting on as I've been hosting more of these is land acknowledgement, which as the students in the earlier session remarked is especially poignant for tonight's topic, but just in general. And as I said, I've been really appreciating thinking about it anew every time and not thinking of land acknowledgement as a noun on a checklist item, but thinking of it as a verb in sort of everyday practice of acknowledging the land. So I want to share both Columbia Oral Histories, our sort of shared stance about land, and in particular, the physical location of Columbia University. But also, I personally want to acknowledge the land as a teacher, is kind of where my thinking is recently, having traveled across North America recently and seeing the difference in land across this continent, and thinking of all of the different peoples who have lived on this land and the different things that these mountains and forests and plains have to teach us, the different things that different land has to teach us. But for the Columbia part in particular, we also want to name that at the here of Columbia University, we are working on the unceded land of the Lenape people who were violently dispossessed from that place. We honor their roots here and the strength it has taken to resist and rebuild both on the island of Manhattan and elsewhere. As oral historians, we also acknowledge the roots of our practice in Indigenous oral history and the ways in which our field as a professional academic space has historically excluded Indigenous peoples and practices from our own narrative. This acknowledgement is only the beginning of a process of building the honoring of Indigenous land, people, and knowledge into our practices as oral historians. all towards the purposes of healing, reconciliation, learning, resurgence, and the pursuit of justice. And so we encourage you to find your own location on Native Land Digital, which is a resource that one of our alums shared with the OHMA community. And I'll just put that in the chat here. I see that some folks are already sharing that, which is awesome. So while you're exploring that resource and sharing your location in the chat alongside your settler colonial location, I also want to just mention this one is a checklist item, that this event is part of the Paul F. Lazarsfeld lecture series, and we are very grateful for that support. So welcome everyone, welcome back to those who've been able to join us for previous sessions. In this series, we've heard from Nikki Yaboa and Sarita Daftari, who've both shared really beautiful and moving works on storytelling and the intersections of stories and people and systems. And both Nikki and Sarita have alluded to kind of the questions of the now what of oral history, and both have brought up education as a huge potential next step and crucial step in sharing these narratives and creating change, creating power. As Sara mentioned earlier with the students, the idea of serving a community and reciprocity as service back to a community, and education being this beautiful option for that. So super excited to hear from Sara and Suzanne tonight on this topic, how We Go Home came about and how it's been transformed now into curricular materials. Suzanne Methot is the author of the nonfiction book, Legacy, Trauma, Story, and Indigenous Healing, co-author of the grade 11 textbook, Aboriginal Beliefs, Values, and Aspirations, and a contributor to Scholastic's Take Action series of elementary classroom resource books. She is a social historian and speaker on human rights, pedagogy, Indigenous literatures, Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous approaches to health and wellness, trauma and a healing-informed practice, and decolonization. She also designs programs and facilitates change-making sessions for the education, healthcare, environmental, and museum sectors. Suzanne is Asiniwachi Nehiyaw, Rocky Mountain Cree of mixed Indigenous and European heritage. Suzanne, if you want to wave. Sara Sinclair is an oral historian, writer, and educator of Cree, Ojibwe, and settler descent. Sara teaches in the Oral History Master's Program at Columbia University. She has contributed to the Columbia Center for Oral History Research's COVID-19 Oral History Narrative and Memory Archive, Obama Presidency Oral History, and Robert Rauschenberg Oral History Project. She has conducted oral histories for the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and the International Labor Organization, among others. Sara is co-editor of Robert Rauschenberg, an oral history published with Columbia University Press in 2019. And it's not in your bio for some reason, but is the editor of How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America, part of the Voice of Witness series published by Haymarket Books and just out last month. So please join me in welcoming Sara and Suzanne.
Thank you, Carlin. Hi, Suzanne. I want to sort of echo what Carlin said and just acknowledge that this is a weird moment to be not madly refreshing the news. So we appreciate that there are distractions, but Suzanne and I were chatting a couple days ago, and we also feel like this is a really fitting time to have these conversations, because it's a time to think about the stories that we like to tell ourselves about who we are, and the stories that we like to tell ourselves about who our countries are. So thank you, Carlin. Thank you, Suzanne, for being here with me today. When Carlin first reached out about creating an event around How We Go Home, I was really, really excited about the opportunity to share you with OHMA, because OHMA is kind of my home, but I think that this is such a cool opportunity for them to hear about the work that you do. So what Suzanne and I are going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and how I think about the power of the stories in the book. And then I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne, and she's going to talk about developing the curriculum. And then we'll kind of open it up, and we might have a couple of questions for each other. And we hope to have lots of time to answer questions that you have for all of us. So this is a pretty cool moment for me because this book actually started as my OHMA thesis. I arrived at the Columbia University Oral History Masters of Arts program in 2012. And I arrived really with an interest in using oral history to amplify contemporary Indigenous lived experience. I didn't know what the stories were exactly that I was going to be sharing, but I knew that I was interested in raising visibility of contemporary Indigenous life because it was so lacking. And when I first arrived in the city, I started to just immerse myself. I just moved here. I didn't know the city. I didn't have community. And so I started to immerse myself in all kinds of community, in the neighborhood in which I lived, in the Columbia community, and in the Indigenous community in the city. And I started to meet fellow Native students who were students at Columbia, at NYU, at the CUNY system, who started to reveal a shared story and a shared sort of narrative arc. And that was folks from reservation communities who had moved to New York City to attend these elite academic institutions, who had already returned home to work for their nations and who were back to get more education, or who were currently studying with the intention of returning home to work for their nations. And I had one lunch in particular with a water engineer named Grace Bulltail. And she was telling me about how she'd, because of the lack of access to great education on her reserve, the Crow Reservation, at the age of 16, she'd had to leave to do her schooling off reserve because she was really strong in the sciences, and it was very clear that she wanted to pursue that path. So she had to leave home very, very early to pursue those goals. And she'd already done her BA and she'd done her master's, and she'd gone home to work for the tribe on a massive water engineering project. And she was talking to me about what that experience was like, of having left, pursued that education, and then the challenges also of returning home and reintegrating into that community. And thinking like an oral historian and a student in that moment, I also felt that her story was really compelling. And then this would be a very interesting project to center my thesis work around. And I started chatting to a friend, Rick Shavoya, about this idea that he had, or that I had. And he said, well, then, you know, I'm the person that you need to talk to, because I used to be the dean at Yale in support of Native American students. And before that, I worked in universities in the Southwest, and I can connect you with some people who share that narrative arc. And so that's what I did. I wrote a thesis that focused on this. The sort of research question was, how does the history of assimilationist intentions behind the schooling of Native Americans affect their experiences of education today? And I told that story through the narratives of people who had that very specific narrative arc, people who left their reservations, attended these institutions, and then moved home again to work for their nations. And very, very quickly, I was so impressed with the strength of the stories that were being shared with me, and with the strength of the narrators that I was engaging with, to narrate North American history in a really new and vital and exciting way. They were able to contextualize their own lives within a long historical frame. And I felt like their stories were vital, and I felt like they were great teachers. And so I very quickly envisioned creating a collection of these narratives that would be a book. So come graduation, I start shopping the thesis around, and I was already aware of Voice of Witnesses' work. I liked their books because they are accessible, because they're inviting, and because I also knew that in addition to creating the book series, they're equally committed to education. And I always imagined that would be the best landing place for this particular collection. I wanted this collection, yes, to be available to a mainstream audience, but also to be available to youth. Because I was conscious of the fact that in the mainstream educational system in both the United States and Canada, Native American history is not made a part of North American history. And I wanted to work in a direction that would help to fill in that gap. So with Voice of Witness, there was a long process, a back and forth of, okay, we love the stories that you've brought in, but we want to expand the central question. We want to be able to include stories that go beyond access to or lack of access to education. So how can we do that? So for several months, we sort of had this back and forth, and eventually we settled on a new guiding question. And that question was, what is it like to be a citizen of a nation within a larger nation whose fundamental economic, social, and political goals are so often at odds? We found that a helpful question because it allowed this sort of push and pull. It allowed us to focus on injustice, which is what Voice of Witness is oriented towards. But it also was broad enough that it didn't eliminate any experience at the outset. It meant that I could pursue conversations with many, many different people whose lives amplify a great range of issues, and then we could take it from there. It gave us a good flexibility for a starting point. So with Voice of Witness, How We Go Home sort of expanded to become this oral history collection that shares contemporary first-person stories in the long and ongoing fight to protect Native lands, rights, and life. Ultimately, the book contains 12 Indigenous narrators sharing their stories that are shaped by loss and injustice, yes, but also resilience and the struggle to share space with those larger nations. How We Go Home is the latest book in the Voice of Witness series, which, as I said, is a human rights oral history nonprofit that works to amplify the voices of people impacted by injustice. And the stories in the book really amplify a number of issues, including Indigenous land rights, environmental justice, access to education, still in there, and healthcare, the carceral system, and violence committed against Indigenous women and girls. And I want to share with you the story of meeting Ashley Hemmers, who was the first person that I traveled with, or traveled to towards my thesis project. Because when I think about the trajectory of this, this work, I think, and maybe many of you have had shared experiences, I don't know that had I not met Ashley, that this would have happened. I think that she was just, it was such a serendipitous meeting to have her be that first person that I met, because she showed me the richness of what was possible. She showed me the power of story in a way that inspired me and that kept me company for the years that followed on this journey. So Ashley was the first person that I interviewed. Rick Shavoya connected me to her in New York City when she was up here attending some event. And the first time I met with her, we met in Rick's living room. He made us breakfast. He made us like tortilla and eggs or something. And then he left, and he left us. I remember very clearly sitting in the sunlit living room in two like cozy chairs opposite each other and just enjoying the spacious time. I think we spent a few hours together, and we got until she was 12 years old. And so she then kind of immediately and kindly invited me to come to travel to meet her at home, which at the time was Las Vegas and Fort Mojave. So a couple of months later, and you know, she's known me for all of 2 hours, I fly out to Las Vegas. She comes to the airport, she picks me up, she hosts me that evening in her home in Vegas. I'd never been to Vegas. She shows me around. The following day, she drives me out to Fort Mojave. And we start the day in Fort Mojave, which is a small nation where California, Nevada, and Arizona intersect. She starts the day with me, taking me to the site where the Mojave believe they enter this world. And then we spend the rest of the day driving around, and she shows me the contemporary lived experience of the Mojave people today in what they call the California and Arizona villages, which are just, you know, settlements in both states. And then we end the day at the site where the Mojave believe their spirit leaves in the peak, one of the mountain peaks, to meet the creator, who will then judge whether or not they have lived their life in a good way. And through all this driving around and showing me around, she's just talking and talking and talking and talking. And I remember actually talking to Mary Marshall when I got back and saying, you know, I just feel like she gave me this enormous gift and also this enormous responsibility. And I just felt so full of her and so full of the stories of her. But it was so exciting. It was so energizing and exciting. And one of the stories that she told me was about how when she was, I think 12 or 13 years old, she was studying in a library on her reservation. And she said she became obsessed with the Holocaust. And she became obsessed with the Holocaust because within the stories that she read about the Holocaust, she saw what intergenerational trauma was for the first time. And she had this aha moment, like, oh, I recognize that in my own community. I didn't know what it was. I didn't have a name for it, but now I see what happens to the following generations of people that have experienced trauma. And for her, it was this incredibly life-changing moment, because she was all of a sudden able to see the difficult conditions in which she had lived so far within a larger historical context. And that story had a great impact on me, because when I worked towards this project, I really always thought about Ashley and thought about that moment and hoped that this book could have a similar impact on young Ashleys today. You know, that this book can do that same work, but also now it's in an Indigenous context, that she will say, you know, I couldn't find books about my own people at the time. And I hope that this can be one of those books that closes that gap. So I'm going to share a couple of slides. Which I have not done in a while. Oh, here we go. Can you guys see that? Yeah, okay. So because we're talking about stories and the power of stories, but we're talking about them in an Indigenous context, I want to start with where. Oh, okay.
What, camera graduation? Okay.
We good?
Yeah, I think so. Lauren, can you just kind of scroll through a little bit and check that folks are muted? Thanks.
Okay. So because we're talking about stories and stories within an Indigenous context, I want to start with where we as Indigenous people think about where stories begin. And that is in the collective memory of our people and our nations. And I want to read this definition because it's something that I want to come back to a little bit later. So I want to make sure that everybody spends a moment with the specificity of these words. Collective memory is knowledge remembered by people with an understanding of the interdependencies of their social, political, economic, and spiritual environment. Local knowledge includes practical wisdom to protect that world. Local knowledge and practical wisdom together form Indigenous knowledge. Holders of Indigenous knowledge are valued by their people for their collective memory. So what is important to emphasize is that collective memory is not simply stories. Collective memory contains the stories that tell us how to be operating in these social, political, and economic and spiritual environments. So the collective memory is really a guide to being a people in a place, and it holds and contains knowledge that is more expansive than the way that we might think about a story in its more basic form. And because I don't think that that's something that's necessarily easy to grasp immediately, I like to share this quote because I think that it makes that concept a little bit more tangible for people who maybe haven't thought about collective memory before. And that is, if we fail to remember our ancestors, our freedom would be somebody else's freedom, not our own. Our destiny, the destiny of someone else. Our ancestors will not even be able to recognize us on the other side. We would have changed so much. If we learned the songs, the dances, and the stories, then we would have a chance to retain the distinct social character that is uniquely us. And that oral tradition is unique to every Indigenous nation and tribe. And there have been some efforts made to preserve this tradition in print form. This is one example, the Mishomis book, which is the voice of the Ojibwe. The elder Eddie Benton Benai created this book to share a depiction of basically what it is like to be an Ojibwe person, what the knowledge system contains, the way of being on the land, in the place, and in relation to that natural environment. He created this book so that the wealth of this information can be shared with people who may not have access to an elder or a knowledge keeper close by. It's another way of passing on what had historically been oral tradition and orally transmitted knowledge. But what's important to understand when we think about Indigenous stories is that while yes, many stories and much knowledge has endured since antiquity, something else has also occurred, which has significantly interrupted that transmission. And that thing, of course, is colonization and ongoing colonialism, which refers to both the formal and informal methods that maintain the subjugation or exploitation of Indigenous peoples, lands, and resources. Colonizers engage in this process because it allows them to maintain and or expand their social, political, and economic power. So back to Ashley. What does that mean within an Indigenous family context? We have the collective memory and we have the colonialism. So Ashley's story for me really is a story about resisting assimilation. She talks about how the efforts of the United States government to assimilate the Mojave people have had an intergenerational, have affected her grandmother's generation, her mother's generation, and her own generation. She in particular tells a story about her grandmother who was forcibly sent to boarding school, Indian boarding school, like I believe 80,000 other American Indians at their peak year and 150,000 Canadians at their peak year. She was sent to this school. She was told that she could not speak her language. She could not practice her religion. She could not engage in her traditional or pre-colonial way of life. And often there was much abuse that was suffered at these schools as well. When her grandmother came out of that school, she came out of that school with a lot of trauma. She came out of that school with a lot of shame about who she was and who her people were. And so she wasn't able to transmit that collective memory to her own child, her daughter, Ashley's mother. It took her, as Ashley narrates it, decades to heal from the trauma that she experienced at that school. But she did find her way. She did find her way. And by the time Ashley and her brother were born, she was able to share some of that collective knowledge and that memory that preceded colonialism. So what's interesting about that story is that as an oral historian, it lets us see where the collective memory exists, where it is interrupted, but also how it can be restored. Because Ashley's grandmother was able to, in time, see that she was not uniquely, she wasn't a bad person. Her language wasn't bad. She was able to see that actually this story is part of a much larger collective story. And there's healing in that. There's healing in recognizing and positioning yourself within a larger collective. And she was able to move back in the direction of that collective knowledge, and then was able to share it with Ashley, who will now be able to share it with future generations. And I share this image just because I think it's beautiful, and it speaks to that story. What you heal in yourself, you heal in your family line, and Ashley's story to me demonstrates that. And so this takes me to How We Go Home. When I think about the stories in How We Go Home, I believe that they contain both that collective memory and that pre-colonial knowledge, but they also share narrators' experiences of how colonialism has disrupted knowledge and ways of being and political and economic systems. And they also share the work that these narrators are doing to decolonize, to indigenize, to rebuild their nations, to revitalize language, to rebuild traditional food ways and life ways. So we see, again, that collective memory, colonialism's interruption of it, but then now this resurgence and this return of knowledge and wisdom. So when I was thinking about who I wanted to include in How We Go Home, it was really important to me in thinking about the narrators that they were not just narrators who could tell stories of injustice, but they were also narrators who could tell stories of resilience, that they were narrators who could talk about not just the trauma that they were walking away from, but also what we are moving towards. So not just people who carry and possess intergenerational trauma, but also people who, as my narrator, Althea Guiboche put it, people who carry the gifts of intergenerational and pre-colonial memory. And the final thing that I want to say before passing this back over to Suzanne, actually I'm going to read a little excerpt from Ashley, is that I also believe that the solutions themselves are in these stories. And I think that that's really well exemplified by this passage. Again, going back to Ashley, she says, when I was in middle school between 1995 and 1999, the US Department of the Interior and US Ecology had plans to dig trenches to dispose of nuclear waste at Ward Valley, about 20 miles outside of Needles. The tribe took this very seriously because water is important. I mean, it's a given, we live in a desert, but also for cultural reasons. We believe that the Colorado River is our life source, and it's the life source for all our animals, for all our children, and our children's children. My grandma and my aunt took us to some events the tribe had at Ward Valley. There were protests on the road that led to the site. It clicked again that I was different. You know, I'm Indian. You hear these stories when you're a kid of the longest walk or Sitting Bull, of all these big phantom Indians. And here we were, a group of Indians, our leaders, our chairman, people we knew, standing up for something that we believed in, and our elders showing us that it was important to fight. I'd never seen that in my own community. I'd never seen my tribe come together in the way that it came together during that protest. It really showed me that even though we were in the modern era, we were still having the same fight. Someone wanted to come on this land and put crap on it, and we were telling them no. The tribal vice chairman called all the children to come stand in front. The adult said, it's going to be really scary. We're going to go down there. People are going to yell at you. Don't worry. There's a law that says we as Indians can pray and not be bothered. So we're going to fight them with their own laws this time. The plan was that Preston, an elder from Fort Yuma, was going to sing, and us kids would be in front. Under the Religious Freedom Act, we could sit in prayer. When we do ceremonies and when we dance and sing, that's group prayer to us. Preston started singing and we started dancing in front of the entrance to the dirt road. The police were there and they had a SWAT team. They had mace, they had rifles. They came in with these big police vehicles and bullhorns saying, please step aside. The one thing I remember so clearly about that night was that as soon as Preston started singing, it all became very real, not just for us, but for everyone. You could feel the non-tribal police were not used to this. They didn't want to touch these children. The people who live in Needles, some of the police, they were concerned too, because it wasn't just about us using the water. It was about them and their families. Their families were pioneers. Their families were railroaders. Their families have lived along this river. And we may not have cohabitated peacefully all the time, but there was a sense of them belonging. The people from farther away, FBI agents and other state police, they were ready to go in. But when we started singing, there was this hesitation. And then all of a sudden, I started seeing the vehicles move away. I heard this huge war cry from one of our guys. It's something that we don't hear often, but I heard it. and I saw my great auntie hear it, and a peace came over me. I could see in her face that she was proud. She looked like a statue that night. She started crying. After that first cry, we heard all the guys cry out. Then we heard the women cry too. We sang and danced all night. So I share that final story because I think what Ashley is describing in that moment is a moment of transformation. She's describing a moment where people who may not have had the opportunity to witness each other, to see each other's humanity, come together. And yes, not everybody is transformed and not everybody changes their minds, but some of those settlers did. They were able to be with that community in a way that they had not been with them before. And they were able to see their humanity and also their shared interests. And I share that story because that was sort of my hope for the book at large, that this book provides those kinds of moments for readers, that it's an entryway for people who may not have had, for non-Indigenous readers, who may not have had the opportunity to get to know Indigenous people, to see our humanity, to see the struggles, to see what we are fighting for, and also to find that shared sense of belonging on this land. And for Indigenous readers, as I said earlier, especially Indigenous youth, so that they may, as Ashley describes in that moment, position themselves within a larger historical context and find the power in that larger story. So with that, I want to pass over to Suzanne, and I'm really excited to hear how she describes her work in developing the accompanying curriculum for the book.
I guess I better unmute. Oh, the Zoom universe. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for that amazing grounding and beginning to our time and discussion together tonight. I didn't put it in the chat box. I wanted to actually say it out loud that I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw Nation. I'm joining you from the very tiny Gulf Island, Gabriola Island. So I'm in between Vancouver Island, which we call the Big Island, and the mainland of British Columbia, or what is now known as British Columbia. I was originally born in Vancouver, but you know, my family has a lot of ties between Alberta and BC. So, the Snuneymuxw are a Coast Salish people, and I am living as a guest on their territory right now. So, joining you from Gabriola. And I guess what I want to share with you tonight is a little bit about the process of creating the curriculum. So I'm going to dive right into a couple of different things. I want to start with the challenges and the successes, and then I'm going to move on to sort of the reason why I did what I did with this curriculum, and sort of the thinking that Sarah and I and the Curriculum Advisory Group hoped would happen. Also going to talk a little bit about pedagogical approaches and how I approach, the way I approach the work that I do as a curriculum writer, sort of the whys and the hows. And I want to end with the things that I've noticed. I've been an educator for going on 30 years now. I started out in adult literacy and skills training, both within Indigenous social service and community organizations, and also within the nonprofit sector, the adult literacy sector. And then in the mid-aughts, I moved into elementary education in the public school system. Both working with Indigenous students and with just kiddos in, Toronto, which is a very diverse city. So working in different schools in Toronto. But I wanted to speak about what I've noticed as an educator, now that I'm working as an education consultant, working with a lot of educators, what educators have been telling me about what their challenges are, about sort of feeling confident around delivering Indigenous lessons in their classrooms. So I want to talk a little bit about how I addressed that in the curriculum. And then I'll take you through, if we have time, I'll take you through one of my favorite pieces in the curriculum package that I developed for the book and for through Voice of Witness. So let's start with challenges and successes. I'll start with the bad news, the challenges. I'll move on to the successes and end this section with that. So for me, one of the biggest challenges in creating this curriculum was that it was just simply impossible to cover the range of everything that I really would love to have covered. I mean, if I had, you know, space and time to do it all, because there is just so much amazing information in these oral histories, in the book, How We Go Home. And in preparation for the session today, I brought out my handy dandy yellow working folder. And I wanted to actually hold up and show y'all the list that I created as I was reading the manuscript version, because the book was not actually even in bound galleys at that point when I started working on the curriculum. And I mean, maybe it doesn't look that impressive, but it's pretty darn impressive for a book that's, you know, this size. I have like a multi-page, I don't know if you can see this, just, you know, note paper. I've never counted how many pages, but it's going on at least 20 with every narrator and like page numbers and all of the major thematic connections that, oh, I could include that in a lesson, or, oh, people really need to know more about this, or, oh yeah, that's a thing. Writing it down. Most narrators got at least a page, some got 2. And I mean, how do I then create, you know, I think we ended up, was it 6 lessons in the end, Sarah? I'm blanking for the moment. So then what I had to do is I had to go through my fantastical list here and of course go across narratives and join everything together in terms of larger thematic themes. And of course I wanted to speak to the themes that are present and make their way through multiple narrators. So that was one of the challenges, is just having all of this amazing information and, you know, realizing that, well, you know, I can't be here forever. We have a publication schedule and we need to make it usable for teachers in the classroom. So yeah, I can't make 25 lessons, darn it anyway. So paring that down and choosing what would actually appear. I mean, it was easy on the one hand. I trusted my gut on it, but yeah, that was one of the challenges, is that, wow, I wish I could have covered more. Like, for example, I wish I could have had a complete lesson on treaties, you know, going into wampum belts, for example, and talking about what the peace and friendship treaties were at, you know, when settlers first arrived in the Americas, and how that relates to today, how Indigenous peoples believe, as we do, that this still characterizes and should lead our relationships today, and how these agreements either are unknown by non-Indigenous folks in the Americas or have been actively, shall I say, ignored, turned away from, or abrogated by settler colonial governments. You know, I would have loved to have done that, but yeah, it just, you know. One other thing that went through a lot of their narrators' life histories and experiences was the issue of adoption or foster care. I really would have loved to have done a lesson on that, but ultimately I also had to think that we were doing it for grades 7 to 8 and up to 12, and then with some college curriculum resource, like topics and resource suggestions on the end of that. I thought, well, can't really go into that. I felt for that age group. So yeah, paring it down. Another one of the challenges that I felt personally is just, I mean, I'm still a baby. I'm only 52, but you know, my life, I feel like I've learned a few things since I was 22, thank heavens. Lord, look back on the 22-year-old me. Yeah, glad I'm finally here. So much more to learn. But you know, reading some narrators and them maybe being younger than me and just thinking, as all old people do, oh, you'll learn, right? And in that sort of friendly auntie way. And then thinking, how do I write curriculum that respects where they are in their journey to reclaim knowledge and culture? How do I respect where they are in their healing journey? What happens when I feel personally, very personal take, others might not agree, but maybe there's a piece here or a piece there where the narrator's a bit unreliable, because memory can be unreliable. And as we're on the journey of relearning, we have to keep learning and adding to our knowledges, right? So that was a challenge around how do I connect with that material, and just honoring that very sacred trust, which I know Sara has mentioned in you know, other places about the trust that was placed in her and the responsibility. So how do I create curriculum that honors their narrators, but still gets to the heart of the issues that need to be discussed? That took a while. You know, there are times that I would go down, start creating a lesson, and then realize, oh, no, you know what? I don't necessarily think that's helpful or respectful at this point. Let's pull it back. Let's you know, turn to the right or the left. So there were challenges, but I was really happy at the end of the process to see the ways in which we made the lessons addressing those challenges and getting to some successes, which for me were, first of all, I think the ability that we were able to embed positive stories and community responses to challenges, the challenges that have arisen from colonization and continuing colonialism, that I was able to embed those responses and those cultural ideas inside the lessons, so that, you know, the lesson showed agency and not just that, you know, we were talking about stories of trauma and victimization, right? That's really important to me, to show that, yes, colonization has been extremely, extremely negative for our communities. And that's true, and we need to talk about that. But how do we show then what people are doing to reclaim identity and to address some of these challenges? So I was happy that I was able to embed some of that into each lesson. And I would say also another success is that some of the things that I wasn't able to include in the lessons themselves, just because of space and timing, I was able to sort of take those ideas out and create discussion questions that I then put into the book club discussion questions or into the college curriculum, where I provided big ideas to post-secondary educators around, here's some of the things you might not know and might want to consider when you frame your work with this book. So I was happy that we kind of found a place for some of the things that I wasn't able to sort of address in the lessons. And the thing that I wanted to address around the thinking that Sara and the curriculum advisory group and I wanted to happen in the curriculum was providing connections, so that when educators read through these lessons, they're going to see the connections between them. Now, you can deliver one single lesson or a part of a lesson if that's what works for your classroom. You can do them in order, you can do them in an order that you feel is better, you know, whatever goes. I'm just happy if you're using it in your classroom. But I wanted to be able to do that, which is show how they were connected, because we really hoped that people would think through these issues and not in silos, and would really think about how everything relates. So thinking about the true histories of the Americas, because there's not just one, especially not the one that's usually told, and realizing that everything is connected. So an example of that would be how removal from the land is related to the splitting apart of the Indigenous family, or the attempt to split apart the Indigenous family in some cases, and how that's related again to contemporary and historical resource extraction and the quest for wealth and power through Indigenous lands. So you can't just kind of talk about how Indigenous peoples were removed from the land. You can't just talk about boarding schools or residential schools. You can't just talk about resource extraction. Or I didn't want that to happen, that the lessons were very discrete, you know, ETE, boom, boom, boom. I wanted there to be some continuity between them all. And so I tried to design them in ways that the essential questions sort of related to the other pieces, right? I think the way that I approach this work, the why and the how, is very much about asking educators, because, you know, most educators obviously are going to be non-Indigenous, although more and more of us are entering the field. But to ask educators to step back from the place of being an expert and to allow yourself to learn alongside the students. I approach the work as, when I write a piece of curriculum, I'm teaching the educator as well as the student. And I'm providing the educator with the means to address these issues in class. So, you know, I created in the preface for educators, you know, just giving them the resources to help them feel confident. So having educators learn along with their students, I think most educators are lifelong learners, but, you know, making sure that they could really inhabit that place of learning alongside, because that is an Indigenous pedagogy, is that cross-generational knowledge transfer, and Sara mentioned this, is key to our way of learning, teaching, and then ultimately knowing and being. You know, we learn from children, and it's not just adult down to, right? We learn, it's that reciprocity. So also trying to put that in the lessons and say, no matter who you are, learn alongside the students in your classroom, listen to their stories as we share and go through these lessons. Another way that I approach this work is what I call my acronym or initials is MBSE. So for, you know, the Indigenous thing around that is, that's how I talk about mind, body, spirit, and emotion, or the medicine wheel, or the idea of balance and relationship and connectivity, interrelatedness. I try to put that into all of my lessons, both through the activities and also through the questions, asking students and educators to think about their own positionality, their own feelings, then make meaning of those feelings, but then relate it to a contemporary action or thing, something that's going on in their contemporary lives, then relate it to the history that they're learning about from this book or from whatever else they're studying, and then get back to the feeling part of it, work through that, so that it's not just a cognitive exercise of learning facts or learning, you know, this equals that, but that there's this whole process within the learner, and hopefully within the educator as learner too, that hints at transformation, because transformation is sacred to Indigenous peoples. That's what we aim to do through our ceremonies and through talking circles. And, you know, is that, and I think Sara has mentioned it already too, that transformation is key to life. That's where connectivity and learning comes from. So in, you know, education pedagogy, that might be called social emotional learning. And I try to include that wherever possible in my curriculum. Also, I think the last thing that I would talk about in terms of how I approach my work is, as an historian, that was my undergraduate degree before I got the postgraduate education degree, was history. I was a history major along with English Lit. So it's very important to me when I'm creating curriculum to, and I'm saying this, you know, funny, but also I'm very serious, teaching history correctly. So beginning in contemporary times and then going to the past, showing the cause and consequence, right? That's very important to me. That's my methodology. And all the historians out there, we can argue about that if you want, but fire up the chat box now. But I think that's really important to do, especially when you're teaching younger students, because otherwise you start in the past and immediately the student's gonna say, oh, what does this have to do with me? And they're bored. And then you don't reach them, right? Or you only reach one student out of the classroom because they're the history nerd or something, right? So by starting with the contemporary day, you immediately make connections to the lives of the students and their communities and what's going on in their families. So by devising activities and questions that help them sort of like, wait, I thought we were talking about these people or this book. Well, yeah, we'll get there. We're starting here, then we work to the past, showing that cause and consequence. Now, I want us to have lots of time for the Q&A. So what I'm gonna do is, instead of showing you, because you can download, by the way, in case this has not been said, you can download the curriculum. It is free through the Voice of Witness website. And I believe it's right on their front page, because How We Go Home is their latest book. And there's just a button, it's a free download. Just, you know, put in your email, they'll send it to you, and it's all there. So you can get it, you can have a look at it. But I will just end by saying that one of my favorite pieces in the entire set of lessons that I created is the lesson on policing. It's one of the first ones I did, if not the first, because it was the hardest. I always start with the hardest. And I approached it through, again, mind, body, spirit, emotion, or social emotional learning. And I work through a whole bunch of stuff first before I even get to the book, around how does this make you feel, the topic of police shootings. And I've got a music video from a tribe called Red, based on the case of John, oh, I'm blanking on his last name. John, I can't remember his last name. He was a wood carver in Seattle who was shot by police, I think in, was it 2010 now? And working through the feelings first and making connections perhaps to their own communities. And also devising and talking about what are the strategies that we use in our own lives and what can we use here in the classroom to help manage how we feel so that we can have a discussion. And by the way, I think that would be very useful in the world we inhabit today, because nobody's listening to anybody anymore. We're just like, so mad, and nobody, just, can we take a breath? Can we work through the feelings, get to making sense of the emotions so that we can actually hear each other, right? So I started with that. And then I get into investigating the issue of police shootings of Native Americans, as you say in the US, or Indigenous peoples, as we say here in Canada. And, you know, making connections to what was going on after the murder of George Floyd, and with the Black Lives Matter protests, that there is solidarity between what was going on and a lot of the people holding the signs in those protests, reminding folks that this is an issue across communities, and that Indigenous peoples are also, you know, the victims of police violence, right? So getting into investigating the issue, doing a lot of check-ins with students, and then sort of getting into the issue of colonialism. And then that might seem like you're like, wait, why are we on this digression? I thought we were talking about policing. But I don't think you can talk about the systems and institutions in the Americas without talking about colonialism. So then we kind of go off into colonialism for a bit there, and we get the students comfortable with how systems affect our lives, right? And then we end with a Socratic seminar and art response afterwards that engages all mind, body, spirit, emotion, cognitive, emotional learning, art education, using their hands, getting out any issues, and that reciprocity of the debate as well, and letting the students lead that discussion through Socratic seminar, putting the control in the classroom into their hands instead of in the hands of the educator, who then can act as facilitator rather than as, devising the questions themselves. So that's one of my favorite lessons, is the policing one. And we ended up putting it later in the set of lessons, just in case, starting there might be a little intimidating for some educators, or might be a little too emotional for kids, especially if, let's say, this wasn't necessarily a group of students who knew each other. So going through other stuff, if educators deliver it in order, and building up that trust, and then we can get into an issue as deep and as relevant to today. It's policing. So I'll end there so that we have lots of time for Q&A. And I hope that shows you a little bit about the process and the whys and hows of how I do what I do, how we did what we did in creating this amazing curriculum. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. Super, super interested. Many questions myself. There are also some in the chat already, and I'm sure others out there have some. I'll start just kind of by backing up into the chat here. And if you have additional questions, feel free to add them to the chat, or to raise your hand either virtually or virtually with the button or on your screen. And we'll try to keep scrolling back and forth to find those. But there's a question from Naomi from earlier on in the chat. Can we address this idea that it is hard to indigenize our curriculum in our schools? Why do some instructors make it sound so difficult? Which I think, if you could maybe expand, Suzanne, on what you were describing with kind of how to help educators do this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and thank you, Naomi. I've encountered this a lot. And I think it's also very relating to the systemic change that we've been talking about like forever, but that seems to have been heard, at least finally, by some people this spring and summer. I think people make change sound difficult because they are afraid. And so their fear just becomes this wall of, can't, but instead of saying, I don't know how to do it, and I'm afraid of making mistakes in doing it, then it becomes, well, we can't do this because, and then it becomes sort of externalized from them. That's what I've noticed. So the thing is, it's not difficult, not if you have well-written curriculum, not if you have resources to help you do the job, and not if you, as I said, approach education as, at least at times, yes, I'm the adult in the room. I have life wisdom that can help these children, these learners come along in life. Yes, of course, that's my role. And I model behavior, and I do all the things that educators do in that non sort of teaching, but sort of still teaching way. But also to recognize yourself as a learner alongside. I think that is really, really difficult for so many educators at every level, whether it's elementary, secondary, post-secondary. I think that's really difficult. In so many like employment jobs today, that is the main part of a person's identity. I don't think it is so in the non-Indigenous world. We tend to introduce ourselves as who we're connected to and what land we are connected to. We have different ways of creating our identity, but I think in the dominant society or settler society, however you want to call it, I think a lot of people have their entire identities wrapped up in what they do for work. And so to be told that, well, I want you to do this, and I know that you didn't learn it in school, so you're going to be learning alongside. it becomes really difficult because their whole identity is that I'm the expert at this and this is what I do. So I think that's why, you know, they make it sound difficult, but actually it's not. We just need to, as organizations, keep producing well-written curriculum. And we need to have organizations like Voice of Witness and Haymarket Books to help facilitate that, getting these stories out. And then I think we need to be prepared to say, and this I think is really good when we model this to young people, to say, you know what, I don't know. You're asking me that question and I actually don't know. But then your next thing to say is, how can we find that out? So that then you go on a learning journey along with your students, right? So that's what I try to do, to address that, because I know I've heard that so much, that it's so difficult. And yeah, it is, but it's also not. So here you go. I give you this stuff. Now go forth. So.
Thank you for that. What's also coming to mind to me, and in light of seeing this wonderful collaboration between the two of you and the way that Voice of Witness brings in curriculum experts, oftentimes in oral history, maybe I could just speak for myself, but there's this DIY feeling that I think a lot of oral historians share. And we believe that education is important, and we envision, like, how great would it be if we could turn this project into curriculum? And then we also can admit that we don't necessarily have that particular skill set, that particular training, and can also ask for help. And people like Suzanne are out in the world doing this work and have that expertise to sort of join in. There's another question here from a little further back in the chat that I don't want to get buried, from Irene. Do you have any suggestions on resources that can help Indigenous students in higher education cope with racism in the academy?
Sarah, do you have anywhere to start, and I'll go grab a book and hold it up to the screen, or should I try to remember the title?
You go for it. You answer this one.
Oh God. Okay, I'll try to remember the title. No, hang on. We're all in our houses. Hang on. It's literally on the table right over there. Talk amongst yourselves.
I mean, I can say that, you know, the place that this book began, the thesis project, was really focused on people who had that experience. You know, the first couple narrators that I spoke with for the thesis, Ashley Hemmers and Wizipan Little Elk, were people who came from reservation communities, and then ultimately they both ended up at Yale. And they had that experience. They had that experience of trying to find their way in a racist institution, trying to find their way, trying to make community. And so, I mean, I think their stories are pretty incredible resources, actually. And their stories are about kind of creating that community. But I'm going to pass over to Suzanne because she's back.
I'm back. And the book is called Colonized Classrooms. And the subtitle is Racism, Trauma, and Resistance in Post-Secondary Education. It's written by a woman who I know professionally, and I know her work. She is amazing. Sheila Cote-Meek. So the last name is Cote-Meek. And it's published by, is it Fernwood? Yeah, it's Fernwood, who actually distributes How We Go Home in Canada. They're a publisher who do a lot of progressive books. And Sheila does a lot of work. I think she teaches at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario right now, if she's still there. It's been a couple of years. And it's just a really, really amazing resource, understanding the challenges and how people address them, and what systems, what institutions need to do to make the place not racist and more inclusive and cognizant of Indigenous ways of knowing, teaching, learning, being. So I would really recommend Colonized Classrooms.
Thank you. I put that title and author last name in the chat if folks are looking for it. There are sort of two related questions I'm seeing in the chat. One is from Rayanne and one from Michaela. Rayanne asks, is oral history an instrument for strengthening family and community ties among Indigenous youth? And Michaela is wondering, how could this concept be re-radiated in Indigenous communities in terms of empowering youth to be educators themselves and to sort of discover and reconnect in that way?
Yeah, I think oral history absolutely is a tool towards healing. And when I think about it, I think about two narrators. I mentioned Ashley earlier, and how her ability to situate herself within a larger context, and also her grandmother's ability to situate herself in that larger context, that ultimately becomes a healing story, because it's collecting to that larger experience that is empowering, to see that they're not a victim of something alone, but they're a part of a larger social problem, empowered both of them to move forward. I also think about Robert Ornellis's story in the book. He talks about how he grew up really, because his parents had that same kind of shame of who they were, of their culture, of the tradition. He wasn't raised with a lot of pride about being Native, but how he moved in that direction later in life and was able to reclaim some of the knowledge. And with that knowledge and that regrowth of culture and access to family and community, he healed himself, but then also how he used his story to heal others. Ultimately, his life's work was in working as an addictions counselor. And he talks about the power of sharing his own story to help other people on their healing journey.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I'm eyeing this question though that I think is somewhat related. Carlin, do you see the question on from Michaela, how could this concept be re-radiated in Indigenous communities, i.e. allowing Indigenous youth to educate and quote unquote correct elders while still respecting elders' authoritative status in Native societies? So that's sort of building on the question Sarah answered about oral history, but I think also relates to this whole idea, which is that by telling our stories, we learn from each other, because it has to be reciprocal. And then I'm making all these connections now. Someone lower, is talking about how the institutions force you to become an expert, get your master's, get your PhD, and I was going to call it the piled higher and deeper degree, but I thought I better not. Get your PhD and then go out and be experts, right? And all of these things are connected, right? So how do we use stories to connect one another, and especially within the Indigenous community or communities, to, yes, be very cognizant about the fact that some of the people who have been elevated to the position of elder or knowledge keeper are folks who attended boarding or residential school, are folks who have a significant history of intergenerational trauma themselves, who have been on a journey to reclaim their cultures themselves. And yes, I've heard things and I've seen things that then I had to then talk to that student and say, look, that's one person. Let's hear someone else's story and add to what you think about that. Don't just run with that idea. All of this is sort of connecting now, like in this big, huge ball in my head, which is that we just have to go back to the stories. And it's when we share stories, and I'm always telling non-Indigenous educators, don't just take one Indigenous person's story or one video on one subject and say, okay, that's the subject, that's the issue. And for some people, you might be thinking, well, yeah, duh. But too many educators actually still do that. So seeking a range of input on whatever it is you're talking about, seeking a range of voices, and then having essential questions guide, or big ideas guide your work, no matter what level you're teaching, so that you can have a sense of, okay, this is the issue, but here's all the different inputs, and make that process a back and forth one. And when you ground it in the subjectivity, in the sort of singular before then you go to the wider context, I think you're able to do that, because we start with our own stories, and then we can go wider. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. I don't know.
No, totally. Thank you so much for that. It's making me think of a question that one of the students raised not in the earlier conversation, but in our class kind of prep document for the week. Courtney had brought up how in, I think it's the introduction of the book or in the educator materials, you all talk about sort of embracing and trying to create room for students' agency on how they want to decide to learn, in particular with student groups who are Indigenous or are marginalized in some way and could potentially be triggered by some of the narratives in the book. And Courtney sort of phrased this question around, you know, how is that made available as an option for students? How do you set teachers up kind of to navigate students like identifying with a group, but maybe not wanting to publicly be singled out in a way of engaging with the material differently? Could you talk about that as well, right? Like an example, absolutely, of students being involved in the decision-making and the kind of group learning that goes on.
Mm-hmm. I think part of doing that is that you have to make relationships with your students and you have to get to know them as people. And when you create a space where they know that you are absolutely your most authentic self as the educator in the room, that they are then free to be their authentic selves. Sometimes I'm called into, well, in the before times, well, still now virtually, I'm called into classrooms or schools to do presentations, right? And I might only have 2 hours, maybe a max of 3. I spend a morning with a classroom or something, right? And so often at the end of that session or sometime during the break or whatever, a student will come up to me and say, yeah, I don't talk about it a lot, but like, I guess I'm Indigenous because like my dad, he's like Ojibwe or Mohawk or whatever nation it is, but he doesn't really know a lot about it. So I don't really know a lot about it, but, you know, and it's just, you know, and then the teacher usually looks at me like, what? I didn't know that. They've never told me that. And it's like, well, they have now because you brought me in. And so for once they felt seen. And so creating relationships with your students means seeing them and creating a space where, you know, when you bring in resources from the community, stuff that you can't address as the educator through your own history, your knowledge, and when you create a space where, you know, you bring in people who encourage them to share their own stories, then you get to know who they are and how they would like to contribute. Because yeah, there's been times when it was clear to me that, okay, that student just self-identified, but not interested in being, you know, called on in the classroom. And that's cool, you know? But then there's been times when, you know, the kids marched right up to me and said, wow, my dad told me this, or my mom said this, or my, you know, and then it was like very clear to me that they wanted to be asked. And so, you know, I say to them, well, would you like to share something? And an example that just occurred in just right off the top of my head is that, you know, I did something on what we call here National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. And I know that's in June for us on the summer solstice. I think you have in the US like a November day, Indigenous Peoples Day or something. It was confusing me when I kept getting the announcement on Facebook because I'm like, wait, it's not June, what's going on? Till I realized it was the American one, right? You know, so I went to a school and I did something with the children. We were doing a round dance and, you know, learning about some stuff and the summer solstice. And then, you know, a student came up to me and said, you know, no, sorry, it was her mom came up to me and said, oh, I'm Inuk from Nunavut and we're living here for a while, da, 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 da. And I was just clear to me that she was expecting something. And so I just said, do you want to share? Doesn't have to be the Suzanne show. I mean, if you're here, I mean, here we are doing a round dance, which is sort of a Plains thing. Do you want to share something from Inuit culture? Like, that would be awesome. If you're ready, if you want to. And she said, well, do you throat sing? And I said, no, of course I don't, because I'm not Inuk. and she was teasing me, so it was good to have a laugh. And she says, well, you kind of have to do it with someone, but yeah, since you don't know how to do it, I guess I could just kind of do my part and at least they would hear it. And I'd be like, and I was like, awesome, yes, please do it. And so it was just clear in that moment that that person was ready. And the student, the younger person who was with her then volunteered to sort of be, even though she'd never really been taught and her mother didn't teach her at that point in her life, you know, she was just a little one. And it was just clear that they were ready to do that. And then there's times when, you know, so you have to know your students, and that can only come about by creating relationship. But once you do that, you'll know when it's appropriate or not to call upon. And somebody made a comment, and I love this, and let's highlight this, that not every Indigenous person is the spokesperson for every other Indigenous person too. That it's you know, this is one tradition and one way of thinking, and then there's so many others to learn about. But does that answer the question? I hope a little bit.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing that we're at past, and I am happy to stay on if you two are available to continue taking questions, but totally fine if you have to leave. For anyone who does have to leave right now, please just join me in thanking Sarah and Suzanne for a really wonderful presentation and for wonderful work out in the world. We're learning so much from you. If you haven't had a chance yet to either check out the book itself or also the curriculum, I really encourage you to do so, to check out some of the lesson plans, do them with a group. If you kind of have a working group or your own classes, give them a try, or at least just read them over and kind of see some of these ideas in practice. It's really wonderful. If anyone has to dash right now, I just want to say that our next event is next week on Thursday. And it is Nupuming, the Cure for White Ladies. The wonderful Leanne Bedesama Sake Simpson will be joining us to discuss her work, which I know has really influenced a lot of us in the OHMA community, and I'm sure many of you out there as well. So really excited to have her next week to build on this really incredible series that we've been having so far. And thank you again to Sarah and Suzanne.
Thank you, Carlin.
Yeah. If we have any diehards that really want to stay, I'm available for another few minutes, like 10 or so. Then I have a deadline I have to meet. But if anybody really wants to stay, I can stay for a bit.
Okay, we'll see how many we lose right now, and then
yeah.
if anyone's around. Does anyone have a sort of pressing question? There was maybe one. If your question got buried in the chat, since we're a smaller group now, if you want to just unmute and ask it, please feel free to do so. Oh, Kay, yes. Kay was wondering, Sarah, if you could just talk a little bit about or Kay, do you wanna jump in and ask your question about the process of editing transcripts for publication in this format? Oh, that's right, Kay has connectivity issues, but Sarah, if you could.
Sure, yeah, sure. So the process for me editing, it's actually, I realize it's kind of the process that I use for almost everything. Like when I move, I just put all my stuff in the middle of a room and then slowly kind of like pick it apart and find a place for it. And I realize that that's the same way that I edit. So most of these conversations have ended up being 7,000 to 8,000 words. And most of them started out as 3 or 4 or more times that size. So some things were helpful. One is that Voice of Witness is particularly interested in a chronological version of events. So I would come back and I didn't do the first round of transcription myself. Voice of Witness would outsource that. I would get the transcripts, I would sort of arrange it in a mostly linear way. And then I had in mind, either before the interview or after, throughout the interviewing process, a sense of like the issue or issues that I hoped that the story would illuminate. And so that helped me like get rid of some stuff that I knew, although it may be wonderful, wasn't going to serve that particular narrative arc or help me to illuminate that particular issue. So that helped me get rid of a bunch of bulk. And then it became like nitty gritty, crazy, go back and talk to them and fill in the blanks and get more stories and come back and do it again many, many times over kind of work. One thing that I found really, really helpful, I was concerned that because I was the sole editor on the project and there are 12 different narratives, I didn't want the 12 narrators to all kind of sort of sound like me. So I really looked for, although when we edit transcripts, we mostly want to get rid of the like stumbling and the ums and the you knows. People do also within that have kind of unique speech patterns, right? So things that go beyond the ums and the you knows, but things that are unique to them. Maybe it's a rhythm or a pattern. So often when I was doing another round of editing, I would go back to their audio and I would play the audio while I was doing the editing. And I found that really helpful. It helped me remember their voice. It helped me remember the feeling that they were telling a particular story with. And it helped me, I think, with the matter of punctuation, with finding the rhythm of an individual person's speech. But the editing was, it was a slog, not a slog that I didn't enjoy, but it was many, many revisions. And, with an eye on hopefully creating something that was really a pleasure to read, but also finding unique ways within each narrative to honor that individual's voice and way of speaking.
Thank you for expanding on that, Sarah. Irene uplifted a question from earlier. Irene, I put Shannon's message there to you about some gatherings, conferences, recommended to meet other Indigenous scholars. So I don't know if Sarah or Suzanne, any come to mind sort of right off the bat in addition to the Association of Tribal Archives, Library, and Museums that Shannon mentioned?
Oh yeah, there's NISA, the Native American Indigenous Studies Association Conference, which meets every year, I think in the spring, in May. It was supposed to be in Toronto actually last year, but got canceled because of the pandemic. But yeah, NAISA, NISA.
Great, and hi Winona, thank you for putting that in the chat as well.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I would also recommend, there's a few universities in Canada who do amazing yearly or annual gatherings. One of them is Trent University in the tiny place of Peterborough, Ontario. But they're one of the first universities in Canada to have an Indigenous Studies department. And they have a master's program in Indigenous Studies, and they do a lot of good work. So for the last like 25 years, they've had an annual elders and traditional teachers gathering. Now, I haven't been to it in many years. And of course now, as of last year, I've moved out west, but I'm not sure what they're doing with the whole pandemic thing. But Trent University in Ontario is a good one. Usually it's in the spring. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Trent, those gatherings are all over Leanne's footnotes in much of her writing, so that's a great connection.
Yeah, she lives close to them.
Yeah. Shannon is wondering, this is probably for Sarah, and I know we've got about 5 or so more minutes. We'll do a hard stop at 1:15. Shannon's wondering, did you record with the possibility of making the recordings publicly available in the future at all? So shaking her head, such as if a contributor or another oral historian wanted to hear it. How do you store the recordings? The kind of archive question.
Yeah, I didn't. I think with this particular project, the outcome was always so clearly a book. And it was not something that it wasn't something that I considered doing for this particular project. I think there was a kind of intimacy that took place. Sometimes I didn't even, and this is like blasphemous to say, but like I recorded some interviews on my phone. Yeah, Carlin's making a face. Some of these meetings, most of them were planned, but some of them were spontaneous. You know, there was sort of equal parts like research and identifying people that I wanted to connect with before traveling, but also sometimes things happen, like Blaine Wilson, who I met when I had traveled out to British Columbia because I knew that I wanted to interview a woman named Gladys Raddick, who lives in Terrace, BC, and she is someone who I wanted to meet with because I believe that her story could help amplify the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And because I was going out to BC and my younger sister at the time was studying in University of Victoria's Indigenous governance program, you know, it was like, well, I'm going to come out to British Columbia. Who else should I talk to when I'm out there? And literally one day, you know, my sister, and this project truly was a family affair because I have a son, my then 2-year-old son was with me, and my sister, Minowe, was acting as our chauffeur and, you know, his babysitter and my friend, and, you know, helping us eat. She took me to the offices of the iGov program at UVic, and she's like, well, I think you should actually meet Tracy. She's the student support worker here, and I think you might want to talk to her brother. And so literally Tracy in that moment said, yeah, you know what, actually hearing about your project, I think Blaine would be a great person to talk to. He's a fisherman and a hunter, and he's really the only person that I know of our generation that's really living off the land in the way that our grandfather did. And I think that he can really speak to you about how environmental changes and how overfishing in the area have really impacted his livelihood and our treaty rights. And so it was literally in that moment, like, okay, well, is he's available now? Fine, we're gonna drive out to Sartlip, and you know, so there was a kind of intimacy that I think not thinking about the archive allowed, if that makes sense. Maybe that's just a terrible excuse, but.
I think there's totally something to be said for that. Yeah. Yeah, a few of us are coming out of the closet, so to speak, here on the phone interview. It happens. It happens. Thank you both so much. Also, Winona shared another really interesting looking resource, actually, of using audio that wasn't necessarily intended to be archived in a sense, and there's still possibilities. The door is never shut in some ways. Yeah, thank you, Suzanne and Sarah, so much, and for hanging out the extra 15 minutes, and to you all for sharing this time as well. It's really been a treat spending this evening with you all, and hearing about this work and thinking about future work, and feeling really energized in a time that wouldn't necessarily seem that way. So yeah, really appreciate all of you. Hope to see you next week for a conversation with Leanne Bedasamasiaki-Simpson, which should also be great. And yeah, just join me in thanking our wonderful guests.
Thanks, Carlin. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
The cohort. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
See you next week.
Yeah.
Bye. Good night, Suzanne.
Bye.